From having more than 90% male guest appearances on his podcast, to excusing cheating men but holding cheating women accountable, here's the real reason why Joe Rogan doesn't have more women on his podcast. The very first reason is his history with controversial statements. It may not be surprising for everyone that the UFC commentator, who was called the Rush Limbaugh for meatheads in a 2017 Medium article, would want more male guests on his podcasts, considering his toxic male element and controversial comments. Over 91% of the guest appearances on one of Apple's most popular podcasts are made by men. While it might be true that Joe Rogan is one of the most prominent celebrities in the world of MMA today, he comes with his fair share of controversies. The 55-year-old hosts a very successful podcast in which he talks to famous personalities and experts from various fields. Some of his guest experiences include Kanye West, Elon Musk, Robert Downey Jr., and renowned fighters from the MMA world like Israel Adesanya and John Jones. So yes, that man is a big deal. While he was showered with a lot of fame and success, it didn't come without troubles and placed him in the spotlight, and not in a good way. That man's got a knack for saying stuff that ends up triggering people, such as his comments on the COVID-19 vaccine in April 2021, when he claimed on his podcast that healthy and young people do not need to take the COVID-19 vaccine. This statement caused a huge public uproar. I mean, do you even blame people for their reaction? I don't. Even officials from the White House had to come on record to criticize the American broadcaster's comments. This is not the only time he's not taking COVID-19 seriously. The American UFC commentator took ivermectin to treat himself with the disease, which is a medicine used to treat heartworms in horses. This made the public furious because the podcaster was once again spreading misinformation regarding the treatment of the virus. The stand-up comedian did not learn from his previous outburst of words at all and started spreading misinformation next. Rogan was accused of giving wrong information about wildfires in Portland, Oregon. In an episode of his podcast with Douglas Murray, many people called out the stand-up comedian for stating that left-wing people were the reason behind the wildfires, when in reality, they didn't have any connection with left-wing activism. He's also been criticized for introducing far-right figures like Alex Jones, Jordan Peterson, and Milo Yiannopoulos to a more mainstream audience. All these controversial comments would be enough to keep anyone away from his podcast, not just women. And if you thought that was it, wait till you hear what's next. Yes, Joe Rogan is transphobic and racist. Joe's comments on transgender MMA fighter Fallon Fox in a 2013 episode of his podcast seemed to be outright transphobic. He voiced his opinion that Fox should not be fighting her cisgender counterparts, as, according to him, she had an unfair physical advantage. Fox even condemned the podcaster in her Facebook post, asking Spotify to cut ties with him. To further ruin his reputation, in one episode of his podcast in 2013, the former television presenter narrated the story of him going to watch the Planet of the Apes movie in a black neighborhood. Rogan said that when they walked into the door, there were no white people, which was shocking since Planet of the Apes didn't take place in Africa. Then, when it finally dawned on him, he admitted that he sounded racist, but continued since he knew his audience would be entertained by him characterizing black people as subhuman. I wish this had been the only incident in which he was accused of racism, but sadly, it was not. In 2020, American politician Bernie Sanders made a guest appearance on his podcast. After their conversation, Rogan gave his word that he would vote for the 2020 presidential candidate in the primaries. But Sanders' followers were not happy at all. They asked the 80-year-old not to associate himself with Rogan because of his occasional controversial remarks. It was during that time when a compilation video surfaced online in which the New Jersey native was saying the N-word in multiple episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience because he knew his audience would enjoy it. At the same time, he was tacitly giving his viewers the green light to use the forbidden word with other white people. Would any woman want to be on the podcast of a man who's transphobic and racist? I hope not. In fact, even stats say the same, that Joe Rogan's podcast has a serious issue with women. For a podcast that's one of the most listened to on the Apple charts and was the second most downloaded show on Apple in 2017 and 2018, it exhibited a shocking lack of diversity. A study completed by Media Matters showed that Rogan had 91% male guests during a 142-show run over the span of 10 months. From June 26, 2018 to April 3, 2019, 147 of Rogan's 161 guests were men, and only 14 were women. But many of his fans didn't seem to care about Media Matters findings and flocked to his defense, including Tucker Carlson. The Fox News host said on his program, Joe can invite whomever he wants since his fans are obviously happy with his program. People prefer his podcast over CNN or MSNBC, and while some people might say he doesn't care about diversity, the truth is exactly opposite. The American broadcaster is famous because he welcomes a variety of opinions, but that doesn't deny the fact that the Joe Rogan Experience disproportionately hosts men. While it may be extremely popular, since it consistently topped the popularity charts on the podcast app Stitcher, and his episodes reached over 5 million subscribers on Rogan's YouTube channel, it doesn't mean it's perfect. The format of the podcast is simple: a freewheeling, hours-long profane conversation between Joe and his guests. Justin Peters explained on Slate why the show is so popular, saying that it is a bizarro fresh air, a rambling, profane interview program in which the host is often high and adores talking about cage fighting. Excuse Joe all you want, but Joe Rogan is exactly who you think he is. While his past comments on a range of issues, such as his friendly banter with Proud Boys co-founder Gavin McInnes, may have hindered women away from his show, it is still not enough to steer men away. In fact, even a horde of celebrities such as musicians India.Arie and Neil Young have slammed the actor, while comedians such as Whitney Cummings and Jon Stewart are calling for him to be shown leeway as a comedian. The truth is bitter, though. Joe Rogan is a podcast host who is racist, sexist, and transphobic. He's cried about white male victimhood and featured extreme right guests who are famous for their white nationalism and other forms of bigotry. That's exactly how Rogan cultivated his huge audience. Yes, Joe's podcasts are watched primarily by young white men. Joe Rogan is willing to discuss any idea that intrigues him, regardless of it being considered politically correct or not. While this may be destructive, it can be fruitful as well. The man doesn't shy away from talking about the layman's anxieties and concerns. He hears their problems and offers them a path for hope and optimism. With his comments and commentary designed to please white men, he became extremely popular and landed himself a 2020 deal with Spotify worth $100 million. In 2011, the 55-year-old gleefully laughed when fellow comedian Joey Diaz described on the show how he pressured approximately 20 aspiring female comedians to perform oral on him in order to get on stage in a comedy show he produced. Another time, he claimed that what he calls woke culture was getting so out of hand that it would eventually get to straight white men not being able to talk. So what's the conclusion? Well, simply that the man has a thing against women, and his past controversial statements have proven that his worldview is twisted. Joe has purposefully wired his content to suit young white men, and bringing women guests would just ruin the image he's made for himself. The man needs to adapt himself according to the 21st century and realize that his popularity will not last long if he continues to make comments like this. In another podcast with David Buss, he basically excused men who cheated by agreeing that men have a higher sexual desire than women, and their reason for cheating was just to fulfill their physical desire. Rogan believes that women who cheat are the real deal breakers since their reason for betraying their partners isn't authentic enough. Rogan needs to be mindful of his comments, otherwise guest appearances on his show will continue to lack diversity. He should ensure women are also featured on his podcast to have balanced content. From excusing men who cheated on their partners, but holding cheating women accountable, to having more than 90% male guest appearances on his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. That was the real reason why Joe Rogan doesn't have more women on his podcast.